Hi, my name is Andrew Sears, and I'm the president of City Vision University. And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about what's involved with developing a trauma-informed organization. So let me just start and talk about, why focus on trauma-informed organizations. Most of the discussion on trauma-informed really is about trauma-informed counseling, trauma-informed clinical care. But what we find is many of the ministries and organizations that we serve, they are serving clients who come from a high trauma environment. So this is especially true for City Vision students. And there's a very strong correlation between increased trauma exposure for many specific cultural groups, especially across social class. So I've written a white paper on reconciliation across social class, and one of the most significant variables that is differences across social class is this idea: is trauma common or is trauma avoided? And that's probably the most significant driving factor of many of the cultural differences across social class, because if you're in an environment where trauma is common, then you have to adapt, and all those adaptations affect the culture. So if you look at social class, the kind of the culture of high trauma environments, then that's going to inform a lot of things. So we talk about this a lot in our cross-cultural courses. And the reason for that is being at trauma-informed organizations likely to be the most significant priority for organizations that serve cross-culturally across social class. To be more specific, so if you're an organization where you have, a lot of people who are, middle class, lower middle class, upper middle class or whatever staff, and they're serving people who are in poverty or people who are homeless, then what that is that's a cross-cultural situation across social class. And what I'm saying, basically, the most important variable in that usually is this difference in trauma. So in being a trauma-informed organization is interdisciplinary. So addiction counseling is clinical trauma treatment, and the vast majority of training comes from that perspective, whereas management is really the domain and discipline of trauma-informed organization. So tying this back into, so SAMHSA, that's the U.S. government's main addiction counseling and addiction treatment organization, has a lot of free resources. They have these tips, and the most popular tip on trauma-informed care is tip 57. And what they do is they divide the different components of that. And most of the components are focused on addiction counseling, but then they have this bottom part here that is on trauma-informed organizations and building a trauma-informed workforce. And that's really going to be the focus of this talk. So we have a whole lot of counseling courses that will deal with these other components. But the focus of this talk really is down here. So if you look at being a trauma-informed organization, so one of the key documents out there also is SAMHSA has a practical guide for implementing a trauma-informed approach. And they have the 4 R's that you need to have in your organization. So, you need to have people in your organization understand how trauma can affect, individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities. And then you need to have recognition of the signs of trauma, a response to the principles of a trauma-informed approach through all aspects of the organization, and resisting re-traumatization. So that's a big part of creating organizational health. And there's a lot of our partners, they're really big on de-escalation. And if you ask them, what is trauma-informed, that's usually the first thing that comes to mind. How do you de-escalate someone who's had a trauma trigger, and they might become a risk to others around them because something got triggered. And that can also be a big part of this. So then you have 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach. So creating safety in physical settings and interpersonal interactions, then trusty worth and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, and addressing cultural, historical, and gender issues. Now, all of these are going to be important. And part of what we do in our cross-cultural management course is we're going to train our students in this, and we have them develop implementation plans using this guide, but doing that across all aspects of the organization. So thinking about how's this going to affect, the governance and leadership? If your organization, what I find with a lot of organizations is they're either too hot or too cold, meaning that they, almost everyone is a program graduate in the organization, and they tend to be, too many people who haven't fully processed their own trauma. So there's just kind of this perpetual kind of high temperature, trauma going on. Or you have a bunch of people who have low trauma background, so it's harder for them to relate to clients. And then, you want people to be trained. You need to collaborate because you're not going to solve all the problems. You have to have adequate resources. You need to have a great, a safe physical environment. I just read a book by Springs Rescue Mission, and they talked about how creating a security perimeter and creating a safe physical environment increased the number of women in their program from 15% to 30%, just because they created a safe physical environment. Engagement, involvement, and a lot of these also relate to the clinical side. So getting adequate screening, assessment, and treatment, and then having good policies. For example, with staff, are you limiting caseload? Do you have measures to prevent staff from getting re-traumatized? Some organizations will have policies where they will provide free counseling for their staff to avoid re-traumatization and things along those lines. So another thing that's important is to recognize the level of trauma experience. So you have individual trauma, then you have family trauma, and you have group trauma, and then you have community trauma and mass trauma. So as I mentioned, a lot of our courses deal with cross-cultural issues. So, part of it is as you move up here, you start, especially the community trauma and the group trauma. In those cases, cross-cultural issues are a lot more significant. So that's going to affect things. So in our cross-cultural course, we want to understand how do those things relate? So many people are familiar with adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So, the different ACEs usually that are listed are child physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person in the home, drug addicted or alcoholic family member, witnessing domestic violence against their mother, loss of a parent to death or abandonment by divorce, and incarceration for any family member for crime. So one thing that's important, if you look at this cross-culturally, and some of these, this actually ties back into here, because ACEs, a lot of times people just think of ACEs in terms of individual trauma or family trauma, because a lot of them actually do relate to family trauma. But if you look at the correlations on ACEs across different groups, that becomes very significant. And that's a cross-cultural issue as you're working cross-culturally that you have to think about. So that's why I want to talk about this here, because it affects kind of the culture of the organization. So this is the most interesting study I've seen on this. So this was a study that actually came out of Harvard, and it was trauma and adverse childhood experience across both race and class. And this graph is a little bit complicated, so I'll kind of talk you through it. So you have two groups. This dividing line is immigrant families and native-born families. So I'll focus first over here, and then you have the different racial groups. So this is non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and then Hispanic. And then what you do is you have different income groups. So this is high income, middle income, nearly poor, and poor. And what you see is, so this is the percentage of children exposed to two or more ACEs for these different groups. So as you can see, the lowest group, at least on children in native-born families, is white, non-Hispanic, upper income or high income. And then as you go down in income, you see the ACEs go up a lot. Now, part of what's interesting, there's several findings. So let me just say what are the key findings that I see out here, and you may see other things. But number one is increase in ACEs, and this is a correlation to trauma, is most correlated with lower income. So if you look across all groups, you can see it's correlated across income significantly, right? Now, increases for Black and Hispanic individuals of the same income range. The increased ACEs for Black and Hispanic individuals of the same income range. So, for example, if you look at someone who's high income Black, there's higher ACEs, or high income Hispanic compared to white. Same thing with middle income, Black and Hispanic. Now, except for non-Hispanic white, this to me was a little bit surprising that the highest group out of all of this is the poor non-Hispanic white. Some people who work in rescue missions that serve this audience a lot may or may not be surprised on that. And it was also interesting to see decreased ACEs for immigrant children. And that's matching for race and income. So if you compare across groups, almost across all groups, that the immigrant children, they have decreased ACEs. That to me was a little bit surprising. But there's probably a variety of reasons for that. I think some of that might be that some of these are coming from more traditional societies where families might be more intact. The other thing is there might be, someone might be low income in the United States, but they might have been higher income in the country that they were coming from in many cases. So that could also, affect things. But part of what's significant is just to recognize that there's these correlations across, especially race and class, for trauma. And that's significant, especially if you're a cross-cultural organization. So now let me talk about having a trauma-informed understanding of race, class, and gender. So it's important to recognize the significance of group trauma. So, group trauma is a racial group. It could be, a group that's in poverty, gender. So racial trauma, gender-based trauma, social class-based trauma. And often group trauma is best healed in a group with people recovering from trauma without a significant risk of invalidation. So, the classic case of this is war veterans, where they come together and they can, talk about their experience, but it can be the same type of thing around racial trauma, gender-based trauma, and social class-based trauma. So as an example, for many, rescue missions, they're going to have separate men's and women's residential recovery programs. Now one, that's to increase safety in general, but it also helps for processing. So if someone's a victim of domestic violence or, sexual assault, it's going to be easier to process that, in a group of women if it's a woman who has experienced that, because it's going to provide increased safety. But you kind of see the same type of thing happening with ethnic churches. So, in healing from racial trauma. And, a lot of times there are group conflict that can happen because group trauma becomes invalidated. So say you get, someone who comes from a really high trauma, poor white environment, and you put them in a group that's, predominantly African American, and they're, that group might have a lot of people who are dealing with racial trauma. Well, it's going to be difficult for those two groups to have as much empathy, especially if there might have been interracial violence, between those two groups. So it's just important to recognize the complexity. So, that is most obvious across gender groups, but it can also be, someone, who may be, say, someone who's African American and they've experienced racial trauma, and they're the only person out of 10 people who's non-white. That can be a challenge. But also it could be the same type of thing. A white male who's experienced class-based trauma, being told it's not valid because only racial trauma are legitimate group trauma. So all those things are significant and important for organizations to recognize in processing group trauma. Most organizations already do this naturally, but part of it is just thinking about, okay, how are you doing this? And to recognize that, if your ministry is a rescue mission that, is really good at processing, say, class-based trauma and poverty and homelessness and things along those lines, it may be good for, people to go to ethnic churches if they need to deal with racial trauma. So, one of my good friends, Sheila Wise Rowe, wrote a book on healing racial trauma, and it's kind of an example of, bringing together a group of people to deal with different, racial trauma. So, one of the things I often will train on in cross-cultural is the idea, and I don't know if you've heard of these trilemmas where you can't do all three of something, and dealing with racial trauma, class-based trauma, and gender-based trauma can be really difficult for an organization to do that. So, ethnic churches and organizations can be very good about dealing with racial trauma. And then, ministries serving the poor or serving the homeless, I would say generally those are going to be class-centric, and they're good about dealing with class-based trauma. And then there's gender-specific groups, and they're going to be good with gender-based trauma. Now, one other thing we teach on extensively here at City Vision is this thing called the competing values framework. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but it's almost like a Myers-Briggs for organizational culture. And the idea is that you have different dimensions that your organization can focus on and can and try to strengthen, and these are intention. So really quick, collaborate. I often call this the ministry sector. It's about creating a relational culture in your organization. The compete is often is about getting money for your organization. This is about having proper structure, and this is about the social enterprises and ability to innovate. Now, for each of these quadrants, and if you've taken up City Vision's other courses, then what's important is each of these quadrants can be helpful for building a trauma-informed organization. So in the collaborate quadrant, what you really need to do is create a culture of staff care. So if you're working in a high trauma environment, I mean, it's kind of like if you have first responders or people, who are in the military where, they're exposed to massive amounts of trauma. How do you care for people? How do you help them deal with, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, avoiding re-traumatization? How do you make it so that they're not, being workaholics? How do you, manage their caseload? How do you turn down the temperature in your organization so that there isn't this kind of perpetual trauma chaos thing that's going on? So that's one. Now, but then in the compete quadrant, so that often these two will, there's tension often across the diagonal. You have to get adequate money for programs and for other quadrants. So basically, this is the fuel that all the other quadrants need. Now, I've seen organizations that have insane amounts of money, but they are still very high trauma environments. And it's because they don't slow down. It's this do things fast. If you need to get the adequate resources to feed these other things, but then you need to slow down. Anyone who's done recovery, you realize that's a part of it. You need to work to get through recovery, but you need to also not try to go too quick. And then on the control side, you need to have well-developed policies and procedures, policies on staff workload, HR policies for staff care, as I mentioned. You can have policies for things, like counseling if staff, feel like that's coming up. So you can have healthcare that includes counseling. If, that can be expensive. You can have policies on staff workload. So a lot of organizations will limit case workload. And, you can get caught in the trap of, we have to serve twice as many clients. But if your staff have a case workload that's way too high, and they're getting burnt out, and you're not able to retain people, and they're getting re-traumatized, and they're, in many cases they might relapse, then you need to have policies that help address that. And then there's also well-developed policies and procedures, so there's reasons why there's rules for clients, because, they can, if clients get out of control, they can decrease the safety for other clients and also for staff. But having, highly structured procedures also increases, the safety for everyone in the organization. So, in our cross-cultural management course, part of what we ask students is to think about how can you do this across the whole organization, in developing a trauma-informed organization. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and this is just another principle from management, it's called the Blake Moten Managerial Grid. And basically the point of this grid is you have two dimensions. You have concern for results and concern for people. And I would say this also could be intensity of the work environment, not just concern for the results. Ultimately, what I found is for most organizations where it's important to be trauma informed, that's because it's a high trauma environment. They're working with clients that have a lot of traumatic backgrounds. They their staff might be exposed to a lot of potential secondary trauma. So ultimately, most organizations we work with are in this 7 to 9 range over here. So the question is, how do you be a healthy organization? Well, the key point, if there's any one lesson that I want you to have is, the only way to offset this is to have the adequate resources and care for staff. So you have to be able to get your organization up here. And it's not just having good heart. You can say, oh, I love my staff. Well, if you love your staff, but they're all working and taking twice as much trauma as is, humanly possible to sustain, you just don't have enough resources. So, do less and balance your resources. So that's the key thing. I think that the lesson that I want people to get out of all of this is to recognize that being a trauma-informed care organization is not just about clinical practice. It's not just about understanding trauma. It's about safety. So how are you creating safety given the fact that, one approach to safety is just avoid ever working with any, avoid all risk, and don't work with clients that have high trauma backgrounds. Well, that's one approach to safety. But for a lot of our partners, that's their mission. So ultimately what you have to do is figure out, how do you establish safety given the fact that you're working in an intense environment. So thanks a lot. Hopefully this is helpful.